Cafe Luna, Seasons of Adventure, Volume 1, by Lux Lucerne. Chapter 11. With bellies rumbling, Zephyrard and Luffy awaited dinner at one of the tables in the cafe dining area. The glint of emerald eyes and the waving of delicate, slender fingers, Zephyrard conjured forth gentle currents of wind around Luffy. He weaved streams of springtime delight which swirled around Luffy, fluffing his fur. Luffy was enamored by the conjured wonders and chased after the lights and dandelions with glee. Waving an outstretched paw or watching the lights flitter away, Luffy's rumbling tummy was kept at bay for the moment. Though it was not long before Nixia stepped out of the kitchen and scurried to sit down next to Zephyrard with hushed enthusiasm. "I see you two had a good chat. I'm glad," she said with a whispered voice. She looked very happy when she walked into the kitchen. "She's finishing things up now." Zephyrard gave her a nod and a thumbs up, returned by a knowing wink. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, filled with relief and tranquility. It had been some time since he truly had a moment's rest. There was no other place he would rather find respite. He opened his eyes once again and continued weaving the winds for Luffy's delight. His whiskers bobbed in the breeze as he pawed at the ethereal puffs. Nixia rested an elbow on the table and chin on her hand as she watched Luffy frolicking in the breeze. He wasn't particularly graceful, and perhaps looked more like a small, clumsy bear, waving his paws in the air than a cat, though that made it all the more joyous and silly. "He seems to be quite enjoying your little dance of dandelions," said Nixia, smiling. "I'm sure the little fellow would love running around the fields of Aventi to see the real thing. Are you partial to dandelions?" Of all the flowers, they're my favorite," Zephyrard replied, still concentrating on his magic. "They're quite popular in Viventi, aren't they? Symbol of hope and freedom, favored by the paragon of wind," Nixia replied. She watched him as he continued, weaving his magic. "I've always liked them. The bright flowers remind me of the dawn," he said, still concentrating, one with the flow of the wind. "And the seeds. It always brought me delight to watch them fly in the breeze, delicate and free. You know, all the paragons have a variety of names and epithets that are told in lore. Though the paragon of wind," said Nixia, closing her eyes thinking. "Hers is the most curious." "The Dandelion Knight," Zephyrard responded with no effort, familiar with the tales. Yes, the Dandelion Knight," Nixia said softly as she opened her eyes. "To think such a powerful adventurer that could cast down the elder calamities would be named after the fragile dandelion. Quite something, don't you think?" She watched him still, now more careful and intentful. The waving of his slender fingers slowed as he thought for a moment. He looked at the wall, perhaps a light, also somewhere far off, wondering, dreaming. Then he turned to her, still guiding the gentle breeze around Luffy, but now as if by nature rather than intentful concentration. "When I was younger, I might have rather been like a lion, fierce and bright as the dandelion blossom," he said with a distant gaze, remembering. "I was always more interested in the heroics of the paragons. Though as I got a bit older, read some more, learned some more, and found a home," he said before going quiet for a moment, smiling. "I realize that's only half of it. I'd like to be gentle and inspiring, like the Dandelion Knight," he said, facing her, eyes resolute. "Bright enough to cast away the darkness, but also gentle enough to spread the seeds of hope throughout the land. Guided by the wind," he continued. His eyes shone as he dreamed, the purity of his soul shining through. "That's why I'm going to stick to being an adventurer, rather than joining the Order of Seasons and one of the Night branches. Grandmaster Yulia of the Knights Verdant had actually approached me," he said, stroking his chin. He shook his head. Yulia the North Wind," said Nixia, tilting her head in curiosity. "I've heard she's quite dutiful and honorable. What made you decide against joining her?" The Order of Seasons do good work, especially the Knights for Dot. But being an order, sometimes they are bogged by bureaucracy. Viventi is a big place as well. I can't cover everything, Zephyrard said with a closed hand. He opened it and held a dandelion floating in the air. It's not enough to simply defeat the enemy. People must be cared for, must be inspired, so that they might stand against the darkness themselves. Seeds must be sown, sprouts protected, so that they may grow tall and stand against the winds to become strong. I want the freedom to go where my heart calls, giving hope to others as the winds guide me, like the dandelion knight. I'd like to be like her one day. Nixia closed her eyes, nodding. Good, good. I'm glad to hear you've learned well and found direction in your life, she said, smiling, thinking of her own adventures in the past. You're not as far off as you might think. Not soon after, the dining area was filled with a warm aroma, sweet and savory, everyone's appetite whetted, mouths beginning to water. Lunaria came out of the kitchen, hoisting a large platter on her shoulder, filled with a number of dishes. Ta-da! Dinner is served, she exclaimed with a bright smile. She placed a box topped with a soft towel on a chair, then tapped it, luring Luffy off the table before starting to place the dishes on the table. She laid out the bowl, one for Zephyrard, one for Nixia, one for herself, and of course a bowl for Luffy. In the center of the table she placed another large bowl, filled with more stew, and a covered pot with more rice, family style. Now let me just grab a pitcher of water and some glasses, and then we can dig in. Zephyrard, Nixia, and even Luffy sat there in their chairs, taking in the sights and smells. Steam wafted off to the food, piping hot, and carried with it that mouth-watering aroma. The meat and vegetables glistened in the light, coated in a rich brown sauce. Each bowl was prepared with care, a hearty serving of stew, poured into a divot of fluffed rice, with the consistency to coat but not drench the grains. Garnished with parsley to brighten the flavors, with the rough outline of a crescent moon. For that moment, everything else in the world but the cafe melted away, as if the ice around their tired hearts melted. Luffy's bowl was filled with care as well, meatballs intermingled with chunks of Luffy's chosen carrot, so the flavors could mingle. It was served warm, but not hot, for Luffy, so he wouldn't burn his little mouth. Luffy looked at the bowl with great intent, his ears and eyes just peeking over the edge of the table as he loafed in his chair. He licked his lips and reached forward with his nose, taking in the smell of crisp, savory meatballs and sweet steamed carrots. In a few moments, Lunaria returned with a pitcher of water, ice cubes clinking against the sides. She poured a glass for everyone, crystal clear water with a chill of ice, condensation forming on the outside of the glasses. Then she sat down between Luffy and Zephyrard and clapped her hands. All right, I hope you enjoy it. Let's eat, she exclaimed with a bright smile. Both Zephyrard and Nixia clapped their hands as well and bowed their heads for a moment. Thank you for this meal, they replied, grateful. Luffy's ears perked up when they clapped their hands and he looked around confused. He watched them bow their heads, and his head bowed as well as his eyes followed them. Then as the others began to eat, he looked at the bowl in front of him, and then to Lunaria, and back again. Meow, he let out, with a pitiful look in his shiny eyes as he looked up at her, head peeking above the table. My goodness, what a polite and civilized cat we are joined by here tonight. He sits at the table and asks for permission, Lunaria said, smiling and smushing her cheeks in delight. It's okay, Luffy. You can eat with us, your people too. This bowl is just for you. You're part of the family now, and we eat together. Oh, good cat, Zephyrard said, nodding before stuffing his mouth. He's very wonderful, isn't he? Nixia said in agreement. Lunaria fluffed the top of his head with the tips of her fingers and pushed his bowl closer to him. He closed his eyes and purred, then sat up. He looked at Lunati and slow blinked at her, expressing his affection. "Ow!" he cried, as if giving thanks, before giving his food a sniff. He licked his lips. Luffy was pleased by the smells, though as Lunatia started to eat, still watching Luffy, she was caught off guard. The little silly cat raised up his small paw and placed it into the bowl, fishing out a meatball. Tumbled out of the bowl and rolled along the table. Luffy pawed at it, then knocked it off the table. Well, maybe not that civilized, Lunatia said with her head tilted to the side in defeat. Luffy squatted down in his chair, waving a paw at the meatball on the floor, before jumping down and taking a nibble from the meatball. It was good, even better than his lunch. Luffy gobbled up the rest of the floor meatball and let out a big sigh, licking his lips. Zephyr choked from laughter, surprised by the sound, and slapped his hand on the table. Meanwhile, Nixia pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, chuckling. It sounds like he rather enjoyed that meatball. I never heard a cat make such a noise. He's a very good boy, Nixia said, smiling at Lunatia. Yeah, Luffy is a very good boy. Oh, he's like a sneaky little toddler. I'll have to keep my eye on him, Lunatia replied, looking at Luffy with squinted eyes and a mischievous smile. Luffy leapt back up to his chair with a soft poof. Reaching up with his paws, he pulled himself up to his bowl and stuck his face into it. He ate with great gusto, bowl tilting and clanking against the table as he ate around it. Neferard, recovering from his laughter, took a breath and nodded at Luffy with affirmation. It's okay, Luffy, I understand. To have a good hot meal in front of you for the first time in a long time is a blessed thing, Zephyrard said, crossing his arms and nodding. During most of my training abroad, I was out in the forests of Aventi on my own. I didn't want to hunt the forest critters, so I ended up mostly foraging, he said, before smiling and chuckling. The critters ended up joining me for meals because of that. They made for some good company. Rabbits, birds, squirrels, sometimes deer. Surprisingly, it was the rabbits that ate the most. They'd eat a pile of veggies the size of them and then flop over onto their sides to take a nap. Oh my gosh, that's so cute, Lunatia said, clutching a hand over her heart. Zeph, you're like a fairy tale princess. You're right, Luna, said Nixia, jovial and dramatic. There are a lot of fairy tales of princesses making friends with forest animals. He is like a princess. Zephyrard squinted and then slapped a hand to his forehead. They would sometimes follow me around, too. The birds singing and the critters dancing around. I guess it is kind of like that, he said, shaking his head and laughing. Though, regardless, having a hearty, warm meal is a blessing, especially on cold nights. As for my training, a lot of the quests I took, the people didn't have much money, Lunatia said, before looking down and poking her belly. Well, they paid me with ingredients instead. I ate so many yummy things. I had to share with everyone since I always had too much food and kept experimenting with making new dishes. Well, I'll certainly look forward to whatever you're coming up with next, Nixia said, nodding. There wasn't a whole lot of good eating to be had while I was deep in the Vesperwood researching. Plenty more good food to be had. I'm glad you showed me that technique of yours before I left initially as well, Lunatia said, waving a finger. Being able to chill and preserve food on the go was really handy. That does sound handy, especially when you're traveling into an area without good ingredients, or if you're tired and just want to warm something up, Zephyrard said, rubbing his chin and nodding. I can tell your cooking has improved too. I really feel a lot better after having some of your cooking. Aw, thank you, Zeph, she said with a shy smile. I do my best. I'm glad you are all enjoying it. And it's truly a blessed meal. Fortunate are we to have such a blessing from our own goddess of water, Zephyrard proclaimed, jolly and overdramatic. He clapped his hands together and bowed his head to the table. Then he picked up his bowl and tilted his head back, shoveling the savory stew into his mouth. The meatballs were juicy and tender, bursting with flavor with every bite. The rice was fluffy, covered with extra gravy, just how he liked it. Nixia averted her gaze and smirked, rubbing a finger across her nose before turning back. Ah, yes, truly blessed are we weary travelers, to have a good meal and good company at the table of the paragon of water, like the winter maiden's feast of yore. Thanks to our beloved cook, Nixia said, playing along. She picked up her bowl as well, hungry and weary like the others, and joined in with their feasting. Her bowl was lighter on gravy, just enough to coat everything, and had extra vegetables. The carrots and sweet potato were tender, their sweetness mixing with the salty, savory sauce, perfect to go with the rice. Luffy was roused by their speeches. He wanted to say something too. He lifted up his head from his bowl and closed his eyes and let out a cry. Lunaria placed a hand on her cheek and looked to the side. Her cheeks had turned rosy. My goodness, so dramatic. You're all eating like you haven't seen food in a long time. Well, it makes me happy you're enjoying it so much, she said, bashful. Both Nixia and Zephyrard picked up their glasses and took a glug of cold water. Like the first rain after a dry summer, they were refreshed and ready to eat even more. They both let out a satisfied breath, placing their glasses back down. Lunaria picked up the pitcher and refilled their glasses for them. The ice clinked softly as she poured. A bowl of hearty warm stew on a cold and stormy winter's night. Nothing's quite so satisfying, except to enjoy such with warm company. Thank you, dearie. It's been a while since I've had a meal like this, Nixie announced, taking a moment from her meal, smiling. Thank you, Luna. This is really great. Your food is something special. It's delicious and nourishes the body, but... He paused for a moment and placed a hand over his heart. More importantly, it nourishes the soul. It fills me with warmth and hope, revitalizing me to the core. He looked into her eyes with a soft gaze, smiling gently. I've really missed sitting around the table like this. Oh, you too, she said as her eyes grew wet. I'm so glad you're both here and you're enjoying it. I've missed it too. She wiped her cheeks, then whispered, to have good food with loved ones around the table is truly something to be treasured.